It's a common critique that the federal government is too big and influential. But are there practical ways to actually rein it in, and can states do anything about it?
Where everything that comes up, we say, well, what's the president going to do about that? And can you just imagine having an American president who comes out and says, that's not actually my problem?
On this episode, we explore so-called federal guidance, a way that federal agencies can influence policy at the state level. And we discuss how a return to the constitutional principles of separation of powers and federalism is part of the solution. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about the proper role of different levels or branches of government. Very excited to welcome into our virtual studio Kevin Williamson. He's a national correspondent for The Dispatch and a writer-in-residence at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Kevin, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thank you.
And joining us in the studio is Bill Duncan, our constitutional law and religious freedom fellow here at Sutherland. Bill, welcome back.
Thanks, Nick. Nice to be here.
I wanted to talk to both of you guys because, Kevin, you have a great piece at The Dispatch on this issue of federal guidance. In other words, federal agencies that sometimes just sort of giving direction or maybe their opinion to folks at the state level. And we'll link to that in the show notes. And Bill has written about this. He has a great report for us at Sutherland called Hidden Signals. We'll link to that as well. But I wanted to talk about this with our listeners because it's sort of this bedrock principle of our constitutional structure of the separation of powers, both kind of laterally with the different branches and vertically with the federal government versus the states. And so maybe, Kevin, to start with you, how would you define this issue of federal guidance? Should Americans care? Talk about what you wrote about in your piece and just your views on the issue overall. What do people need to know?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's try to keep this calm and civil, because I know that other than the Jones Act, nothing will start a fist fight quicker than the question of examining the various weights of different kinds of pieces and levels of federal guidance. So federal guidance is the stuff that is neither a law nor a regulation. So laws are passed at the federal level by Congress. They have a procedure they go through. They get signed by the president or vetoed, or they become law without his signature. And these laws are made by people who vote for lawmakers. Sometimes these laws create the opportunity to create regulation based on the laws. The regulations are issued by federal agencies. There's a formal procedure for this that involves comment and review and input and all that kind of stuff. And there's also some accountability built into that because the people in the executive agencies work for the president who was elected. And so you've got those two things. And then there's this third thing that one of my CEI colleagues, Wayne Cruz, calls regulatory dark matter, which is this gigantic morass of memos and guidance letters and opinions and other sorts of informal things that aren't law exactly, and they aren't regulations exactly, but they have increasingly a great deal of regulatory weight. Because when you're looking at a question like, well, what kind of a body of water counts as a body of water under the Waters of the United States Act or something like that? Or what can I do under this vague, maybe tenuously written regulation in the Farm Bill that will get me in trouble or not get me in trouble with the EPA? That's where this stuff comes into play. So it's not something that goes through the lawmaking process. It's not something that goes through the regulation-making process. And it can be conflicting at times. It can be vague. It can be obsolete. It can be outdated. No one knows how much of it there is. But and it's hard to access because it's not available in any organized place or way. And but it really does matter from time to time if you're a business or an individual trying to comply with the regulations to which you are subject. That can get you in lots and lots of trouble. That can ruin your business and bankrupt you and maybe even get you thrown in jail at some point if you don't follow them to the T. You need to know how to follow them, and it's not always clear. So it's this big kind of vaguely defined morass of extra legal material that's used in the interpretation of regulations that doesn't have quite legal or regulatory standing.
Bill, given Kevin's description, if federal guidance, and I'm using air quotes for our folks listening, just because it is sort of this nebulous thing, as Kevin's saying, if it's not legally binding, like, why do people care? Why, at the state level, if some federal guidance letter came down, why wouldn't a state agency say, it's not legally binding, no thanks?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I loved Kevin's description. I think that was really helpful. And as helpful as it can be, given that how nebulous it is. I think that the reality is, if you are highly regulated, as many state agencies are, they either taking money from the government, they have some kind of oversight from a federal agency. They have a strong incentive to get along with their regulators, so they can avoid complaints, avoid charges of disobeying a regulation. They know they're going to have to work with these people in the future, and so when they get a letter, the way that I sort of became aware of this was through work with in the education world. And it's not uncommon for the U.S. Department of Education to send what we call Dear Colleague letters. So they're kind of like just what used to be called circular letter. It's just a long letter that says, here's how we think the law should be interpreted. And here's what we're going to be looking for as we get complaints from students or get complaints from parents or whatever. This is what we're going to be looking for to see if you're in compliance. Now, as Kevin pointed out, that's not law, and it can have a very tenuous connection to the actual law. But having said that, if I'm a principal, do I want to say, I'm not really sure. Let me go back and look at Title IX or whatever provision, and then when I'm done with that, then I'll look at all the regulations, which could be really hard, not easy to find. Or do I just go along with what this letter says? The answer is I'm going to often just go along with what that letter says. It's common sense. It's not the right result, but common sense suggests that particularly state agencies are likely to say, well, why fight this? Now, the other reality, and I think Kevin helped us understand this well, is that there's no elective accountability. If I find out that something has happened in my in our local, and during the legislative session here in Utah, and someone's passed a law that's really kind of infringes on something that I think is important, I run into my legislator. I go to a caucus meeting. I go to the grocery store and see this state senator and say, well, why did you do that? And we can push back, and they're getting some, at least, kind of constant feedback on how we feel like things are going. But who writes these letters, these guidance documents, handbooks of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration? Who is in writing those? There may be some accountability at some very high level, but it's pretty remote from the people who are actually affected. And I think that's one of the reasons we feel so much concern about the use of these in the place of law.
And it's probably also worth noting here that the relationship, particularly between businesses and state level regulators and federal level regulators, is very, very different. I've written a lot about the oil and gas industry, and when the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection comes into a gas drilling operation and says, we want to talk to you about X, Y, or Z, they'll say, well, come by at 3:00 and have a cup of coffee. We'll have a conversation, and we'll try to figure it out. And whatever you want us to do, we'll try to do 110% of that because we want to stay in compliance. When the EPA calls them up, they say, talk to our lawyers, and we'll get back to you. And if you want to talk to us, bring a court order or a subpoena or something, because we're not going to deal with you if we don't have to. And it's a very, very different kind of relationship. But then you've got the federal agencies leaning on the state level agencies and saying, if you want grants, you want to be certified as being in compliance with this, that, or the other, then you're going to have to do our bidding as well.
Kevin, one of the things I've heard about this issue, and I hear this in general in the conversations around sort of the growth of the federal government, the scope or the influence or the reach of the federal government, there are those out there who say, well, no, the federal executive agencies, those are the quote-unquote experts on these various issues. So it makes sense that they would be more involved in some form of public policy making because they know this stuff, Congress doesn't. So I think there are some out there who say, yeah, it's good that federal agencies should be deeply involved in these issues. That's kind of their job. But I want to put that to you and ask, why is this a bad thing? And maybe one frame I'd toss out is the political frame that for folks out there right now who really do not like the Trump administration, do you really want a federal agency that reports to President Trump having a lot more authority and influence outside the congressional process? Or for folks on the other side, if it were a Harrison administration, or in the future, if it's a Newsom administration, do you want that administration having this level of power? So I toss all that out to you. Why is this bad in your view?
Well, there's a number of reasons. One, I mean, if you, from just a sort of political theory point of view, that legitimacy and accountability are connected to one another, and where there's no democratic accountability, there are questions about the legitimacy of these decisions. But there's also this problem of American political culture, I think, for lack of a better word. So I think if we had a kind of political culture that wasn't quite so maximalist and opportunistic and particularly focused on the executive, it would be a different thing. So we have a presidency, and I say a presidency, not a president. We have a presidency in which the occupants of that office look at the laws and the regulations on the books and say, what can I do? What pretext can I come up with based on this stuff to get the stuff done that I want to get done? They don't look at them and say, how can I, as the person charged with the faithful execution of the laws, faithfully execute these laws? Those are very, very different sorts of attitudes. So if you want to tell me that, we're going to have some level of regulation of low-level radioactive waste produced by medical research facilities and how much can go into what kind of disposal, and we're going to leave that to some experts at a regulatory agency to come up with a standard of parts per million or whatever, fine, I'm okay with that. We probably don't want Chuck Schumer being out there with his, Geiger counter trying to figure this stuff out on his own and writing it down to that level. Probably want some expert input there, although there's no reason the expert input couldn't go to Congress and have them vote on this stuff, because you'll often get different experts with different opinions on things, which is why we have a political process, is to sort those things out. But it's not, the worst thing in the world to punt some of this stuff over. The problem is when you've got an executive branch that is interested in usurping legislative power and that is interested in finding any pretext to get the sort of things that it wants done. So right now in the news, we've got this crazy thing where the Trump administration is trying to basically force the states to rewrite their election procedures. And one of the things it's doing is saying, well, we're going to have some new conditions attached to FEMA grants. And that if you don't rewrite your election procedures the way we want them to, then you're going to lose, I think it's a total of around $1 trillion across the states in anti-terrorism funding and things related to that. Now, one of these things doesn't have anything really to do with the other. It's just the executive using a leverage point to try to get something done that it has no legal status to demand. And because states are constitutionally in charge of their own elections. So you end up with this erosion of the separation of powers between the states and the federal government, separation of powers within the federal government. And you want to have clearer lines, I think, of demarcation. Unfortunately, it's not one of those things where you can come up with a hard, fast rule and write it down in 150 words and make everyone swear a public oath to uphold this standard, because it does require judgment and discretion and prudence and all those things. And those have to be based in a right kind of attitude about this stuff. So one of the problems with the separation of powers is that you need separate branches that are interested in preserving that separation of powers as a principle for its own sake, rather than just as a pretext for trying to get done politically what they want to get done politically.
Kevin, is that one of the areas where I think this theme comes up a lot whenever we talk about the various political or policy challenges at the federal level? This common thread is that, well, Congress essentially isn't doing its job. It has. So I'll ask it, is this accurate, a perception that you have a presidency, an executive branch that increasingly wants to do more things sort of beyond maybe the original constitutional intent of that branch, and you have a Congress who's kind of happy to hand over a lot of their authority or their power to do policy making because it means they don't have to make these tough choices? And, can they then just go pontificate on TV and get reelected? I mean, maybe that's a cynical take, but is it sort of, in some ways, and this actually ties back to the episode of the show we had Sarah Isger, one of your colleagues at the Dispatch, talking about her new book, Last Branch Standing. It seems like, and I'm not an attorney, so not an expert in this space, so you guys have to set me straight, but it seems like it's almost like you have two branches, the executive branch and the legislative branch, the federal level, that are both happy to muddy the waters of the separation of powers.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so for a couple of reasons. One is that, and this is sort of an almost literary and a dramatic theory of how government works, but monarchy is a very loaded term. But say monism, focusing power on one person. I think it's just a natural kind of human tendency, and there's a drift in that direction across all forms of government. And if you think about, other than the president, who do we have to pay attention to in Washington? There's 435 members of the House, 100 guys in the Senate, 9 people in the Supreme Court, and some cabinet officials who are pretty important. So, 500, 600 people you got to pay attention to. No one's going to do that. Paying attention to one guy and having a lot of opinions about one guy is a much easier thing to do. It's like, modern action movies are written and directed under a mandate to make sure you've always got the hero on the screen in every frame, essentially. And for every frame that he's not on the screen, that's a problem. And you got to think of a way to maximize, the presence of your star. Our politics kind of works that way too, where everything that comes up, we say, well, what's the president going to do about that? And can you just imagine having the American president who comes out and says, well, that's not actually my problem. It's not my responsibility. It's not what I do. I'm here to faithfully execute the laws that Congress passes. And if Congress would like to change this, Congress may pass a law. Imagine, President Jones, what are you going to do about immigration? Well, I'm going to enforce the law as best I can. And if Congress would like something else done, Congress can let me know what Congress wants done. That's just not how our politics currently works, but we need to press it back in that direction. Unfortunately, the incentives for congressmen to act like congressmen and lawmakers are pretty low, whereas the tendency to become what my colleague Jonah Goldberg calls a parliament of pundits, to just hold out for that next cable news hit or that next viral social media moment is it's very strong because you can monetize that stuff, and not only monetize it but also translate it into real democratic political power. Whereas being the Daniel Patrick Moynihan guy who's going to spend 25 years kind of digging into one issue and trying to make tiny little incremental changes along the way to improve it is something that doesn't have a lot of great payoff. So unfortunately, the incentives are different, which means that like all problems in our society, it comes back to or not all problems in our society, but all problems in our politics come back to the electorate, because the electorate are the ones who create the incentives. We're the ones in charge. We're the ones who decide what people get rewarded for. We're the ones who decide what people get punished for. And it's no accident that we've elected a reality show host, because we've been treating our politics like a reality show long before Trump came along. And he just sort of, ratified it in a sense.
Bill, I want to ask you, because you've written at length about this. And again, we'll include links in the show notes to Kevin's piece at the Dispatch, and Bill to your Hidden Signals paper for Sutherland Institute. But are there specific examples of this? You mentioned briefly kind of the Dear Colleague letters in the education space. Are there other examples you can point to that if we're trying to help folks understand, okay, here is where essentially the federal government exceeds its authority through this federal guidance, through federal agencies trying to influence folks at the state level, that it really is outside the constitutional congressional policymaking process. And there's a whole number of reasons for that, as Kevin has articulated well. But what would you say are some of the most, I guess, gripping or compelling examples of where this has happened in a way that should make all of us say this is not a good way to run a country?
Yeah. Gripping and compelling are not typically the blurbs you see on the front of agency guidance, but let me give you two examples. One is maybe a little more lighthearted than the other one. So the title of the report on agency guidance is called Hidden Signals, and the joke, to the degree it's funny, in that is that the Department of Highway Safety, I think is the name of the organization. It's a federal agency. They issued a handbook. So it's multiple, hundreds and hundreds of pages of direction directed, like Kevin described, to state agencies. So if you're the Utah Department of Transportation and you're trying to figure out, how do we build certain roads or whatever, and they say, well, we have these expectations. Well, one of the things that they said is that States should not use their like billboards, the billboards they use, or like the electronic boards that they use to say the slow down and pacing or whatever. They shouldn't use jokes in those because that could distract drivers. This makes you wonder about, I mean, what expertise, sort of is that based on? Maybe it could be distracting. But so the state of Arizona, they had a Taylor Swift come and do a concert there, and they put some Taylor Swift lyrics as jokes on there. And whatever you think of that use of state money, it hardly seems like a federal issue. But that's the type of thing. So the reason that's a helpful illustration is how would anyone from day to day know that there is such a thing as a highway safety administration handbook? What its implications would be if they want to include some silly jokes on electronic billboards. So that's maybe one example. Another example that's maybe a little more compelling, probably for people who have children in school, is direction that was recently given to elementary and so secondary school. So this goes right to your neighborhood public school about what would count as a valid discipline if a student acts up in class, and simplifying, of course. The guidance says that the schools need to ensure that the proportion of disciplinary actions taken based on categories of students, race or socioeconomic status or whatever, that they're in the right proportion. So what does that look like in practice? Well, it would mean a school would have to say, well, gosh, we've got these different students, they've done these things, but we can only punish certain ones and not others, or we can at least only report whether we're punishing based on, where they fit, sort of what category they come into in terms of federal classifications. Not only is that maybe, whatever you might think of that policy, think of what that does for families who are wondering, wait a second, why is my child being sent home from school? Or why are they being suspended? Or why is my child doing something that seems less serious than what someone else has done? Or for an administrator who's, trying to figure out how to sort of operate from day to day and trying to keep kids safe in a school setting. But they're getting this direction that again, as you pointed out, is nominally comes because of some expertise, but probably doesn't really reflect. Even if there's some expertise that's theoretically behind that, does it really work in Heber City or in a local school district? All of these things are the types of things I think that get people concerned, and they wonder, why is my school doing this? And the answer could be this hidden signal. There's a signal somewhere, someone's picking it up, but I'm not seeing it, and I have no way of pushing back if I think, who came up with that crazy idea, right? And like in those particular situations.
And one of the ironies is that when people and agencies want regulatory guidance, it's sometimes hard to come by. Some of you all will remember this famous case of the New Haven Fire Department from some years back, a civil rights case, where they had examination for promotions. And the results were such that if they used the exam, then there wouldn't be any African Americans from the applicant pool promoted. And but then if they decided to promote those African American applicants anyway, they'd be treating different people of different races under different standards. So they said, on one hand, the civil rights law says we can't use different standards for people of different races. On the other hand, we can't do things that have a quote unquote disparate impact, which is not statutory language. That's an administrative and judicial creation. So whatever we do, we're going to be on the bad side of one of these principles or the other. And if I'm remembering correctly, they went to the DOJ and said, what do we do here? And the DOJ basically said, well, good luck. You're going to get sued either way. And I guess we'll let the Supreme Court figure this one out. And if I'm remembering correctly, that did go to the Supreme Court at some point.
So Kevin, what do we do about this? I mean, from your perspective on the national level, what would be the right policy fix or even a political culture fix?
Well, political culture is, if you want to change the culture, I mean, there's prayer, I guess, is a place to start. It's not the sort of thing you can pass a law to say, be better people and be more responsible and be better citizens and better leaders. I think that, federalism and devolution are really helpful here. I've argued for a while that irrespective of what you think about, say, gun regulation policy, there isn't really much reason to do it at a federal level. It's certainly one of these things that could probably be done by the states, and that different states would end up having different laws that are all different versions of things that are consistent with the Second Amendment, just as we have different rules about parade licenses and other things like that that are all consistent with the First Amendment. And it would kind of make sense from my point of view for Wyoming to maybe not have the same rules that apply on the subway in New York City. Maybe it's okay to have some slightly different standards and procedures and practices. But as long as you have a federal government doing that, and so one size fits all thing for this whole very large, sprawling, diverse country of ours. And when we say diversity, we always think about, kind of race and sexuality and sex and things like that. But, the difference between urban America and rural America is very, very large. And how life is actually lived in a place like Dumas, Texas versus Los Angeles is, this is radically different places. They're not in different countries, but the way you live your daily life can really be very, very different. So a lot of these things I think can move down that way. There are some things that are obviously naturally national issues, and our constitutional order sort of contemplates that things like immigration, international trade, national security, international relations, things that cross the national border by their nature are going to be federal issues. That probably applies to at least some environmental things. I would think like maybe the, regulation of nuclear fuels and things like that. But there's a lot of stuff that we do with things like the Clean Air Act that probably could and should be done locally. Again, because I think Los Angeles, especially Los Angeles, 30 or 40 years ago, had very different needs on clean air regulation than Baggs, Wyoming did. And where there's nothing of any industrial consequence for like hundreds of miles in any direction, as far as I can think. Maybe some mines or something. But so yeah, as much as we can move stuff down to the states and to the municipalities and recognize the fact that the need for national policy, for truly national policy, is actually much more limited, I think, than we sometimes act like it is. And the good thing about that is it kind of builds in some incentives of its own, because if you're, a very kind of ideological activist type on either side, there's not as much incentive for you to go into something that's going to be regulated at the state and local level as there is something that's going to be regulated at the national level, where you can have a much bigger career. Like, none of us knows anyone who's a partisan ideological fanatic about planning and zoning issues. I mean, we don't. It all gets, there are people with different opinions about it. Ezra Klein and I could probably yell at each other for an hour about this stuff, even though we largely agree on a lot of these things. But there's not, some national, there's no Roe v. Wade and Dobbs of planning and zoning. It's just not a thing. People don't care about it that much because it is generally done at the local level, where people feel like they have more influence. They know the people who are making the decisions. They have more input on those decisions. So not everything has to be an issue. We used to have an expression, I'm sorry you're upset about that, but there's no need to make a federal case about it. But we literally make a federal case of like so many things that it's counterproductive, I think. So that'd be a good step, I think. But again, that requires some political and cultural buy-in from people who are willing to say that I'm willing to let this issue be a relatively low-profile, low-intensity local issue rather than a big national or international crusade.
Well, Kevin, there's a lot of parallels with this. We had another recent episode of Defending Ideas talking about the Utah Federalism Commission and the National Federalism Initiative with two state legislators, one who's Republican, one who's Democrat, and coming on the show to talk about their agreement of the need for more federalism. And I don't want to overstate it, so reel me in if this is a little too much, but in a lot of these conversations about sort of the broken nature of our politics at the national level, I almost feel like a pro-federalism argument is almost kind of this grand unified theory of everything, that if we just restore the separation of powers and the principle of federalism, a lot of our political problems would go away or at least be severely diminished. Is that overstating the case?
I don't think so. The obvious example here, I think, is the question of abortion. Dobbs was seen as a very big, important cultural, symbolic victory for one side of the political debate and a big defeat for the other side. But by returning that issue, this very difficult, emotionally loaded issue, to the state legislatures, it did create a situation in which, over time, we can allow that thing, which was a national, enormously important, urgent national issue for the entirety of my life. I was born 3 months before Roe v. Wade was decided, to be something that gets decided at the local level. Now, that doesn't mean that people are going to stop caring about it, but it does mean that we're going to have different laws in Connecticut and Massachusetts, New Jersey, probably than we do in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, and that more people will live under a set of laws that are closer to their values and their preferences, and that are made by people they feel like they have more input on. You know, I pointed out in a few of my pieces that if you're in the Nebraska state legislature, you've got 38,000 people to answer to. That's a lot of people, but that's not huge. You know, I was the editor of a newspaper one time in a town of 70,000 people, and I kind of felt like you could kind of know a community of 70,000 people. You can know a community of 50,000 people. But if you're a member of the House, you know, you represent 700,000, is it 800,000 people now, something like that, and that's a very different proposition, and both for the person in office and for his constituents. Being one of 38,000 is very different from being one of 1 million or 800,000 or 700,000. So, and I think that even on this very, very contentious issue of abortion, unless my political radar is way off, it does seem to me like that post-Dobbs it has died down a little bit. That there have been situations where you've seen, you know, some pushback against laws that were seen as overly assertive or badly written in places that are thought of as conservative. You've seen less strident backlash in places that are seen as progressive or left-wing than you might have expected. And people do seem to be more contented living under locally and state-made laws than under a one-size-fits-all federal solution for a country that has some very, 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 very different parts. So if you can do that with something like abortion, I mean, you're telling me we can't do it for, you know, mercury levels, or you know, this or that pollutant, or you know, this or that financial instrument. I think we probably can do some of that.
Bill, in your Hidden Signals report, I know you've thought through this, but on the policy side, what policy levers would you suggest, or have we seen, either at the state level or maybe even at the federal level, to, on this one issue of federal guidance, kind of maybe try and rein in the federal government a little bit in this broader effort that Kevin's talking about restoring the principle of federalism and separation of powers?
Yeah, I think Kevin's right that's ultimately what would make a real difference. Having said that, there are some modest things that Utah has tried to do in the last couple of years that we feel could make some difference on all these questions. And so just specifically what Utah did is to require that when state agencies, so this doesn't apply in situations where a private business gets the guidance, but when the state agencies get the guidance, they have to make that publicly available. And each year the State Federalism Commission's given a report that's told, and they're told, here are the specific things we were asked to do by the DOJ or Health and Human Services or Department of Environmental Quality or whatever. Here's some specific things we were directed by federal agencies to do. And given all of that, there's at least the possibility that we now have a sense of, you know, where this guidance is coming from, what its nature is, and theoretically that gives states some incentive to push back when they recognize we're going to be in trouble if we implement this. We need to ask our congressional delegation to intervene or to say something, or maybe the legislature needs to, the state legislature needs to just say we won't comply with that guy. We direct the agencies not to comply, which, you know, of course is not always easy, but at least makes this kind of adds some transparency to an issue that's otherwise kind of mysterious, I think, to most of us. So while that doesn't get us to the end of the row, at least I think could move the discussion at the state level in a different way than it's currently going.
At the risk of sounding like I'm pandering to the room, if what you're saying is make the country more like Utah, I'm okay with that.
we sort of always have that sub theme, but
yeah, I mean, I will echo that. I'll say that, yeah, that there are a lot of things we do well here in Utah. That's actually what I was going to ask you, Kevin, is in the few minutes we have left, maybe Kevin will give you the last word. Is it as simple as that, as a first step to say, well, do we need a congressional law that mandates the same kind of transparency we have in Utah if that's not in place, or is there something else? What's kind of the first essential step to move forward? What advice would you give to policymakers or voters?
Well, I would emphasize that I think the secret sauce is really always culture, and that's true of states and regions as much as it is of the national government. And Utah has a much healthier, I think, kind of civic culture than New Jersey or Rhode Island or Louisiana or Alabama, some of these other less well-governed places. Transparency, I think, is particularly at the state level great because states don't have a lot of national security concerns and things like that. States don't have a lot of reasons for keeping secrets the way the federal government sometimes does. This movement that we've seen over the last couple of decades of just like essentially putting national checkbooks or state checkbooks online for people to review and see what the actual transactions look like, I think is very, very helpful. You run into some shortcomings with that too, just in that, government does so much, it produces so much data that regular citizens can't really interface with it. And people who use the word interface as a verb, like I just did, should probably be drummed out of politics anyway and disenfranchised. But it's hard to handle. There are people like me who follow a couple of issues for a living. It's my job. I do it like it's my job because it's my job, and I still find it difficult to keep up with people who have other sorts of jobs and other responsibilities in life and don't have the kinds of free time and resources that people like us do, or the sort of professional incentives that people like us do to follow this stuff aren't really going to be able to maybe make the most use of it, and it's going to be experienced by them, I think, as another kind of overwhelming burden of citizenship rather than an opportunity to do something meaningful. So we're always going to need those, intermediaries. It's one of the reasons I really worry about the decline of local press and local newspapers, which used to do a pretty good job of putting this stuff into context and digestible form for a lot of people. The local newspapers were not only the place where information came in, but they were also kind of the local memory of these places. They had the institutional knowledge of, here's what we did on this 30 years ago and why it didn't work, or why it did work, or how we solved this problem. There are fewer institutions doing that kind of stuff. So you need a healthier relationship, not only between the people and the government, but also between those really important mediating institutions, whether they're business groups or newspapers or other sorts of institutions like that. So, yeah, I suppose, and I'm halfway writing a book about this. I'm not sure if I'll finish it, but we really need a different attitude towards citizenship, and just to understand that citizenship is this active thing, and it's not just about showing up once a year in November to vote. That your duties as a citizen in a free, self-governing republic are pretty extensive, and they require a lot of time and effort and intellectual work on the part of all of us, including those of us who are maybe not necessarily always inclined to do that when we'd rather be watching hockey or whatever it is that people do when they're not doing what I do all day. So, it's there's no magic bullet. There's no law that you can pass that's going to make this culture change. It's going to make our model citizenship change, but we can try to set better examples, I think. We can try to have conversations like this one that people can participate in and learn from, and maybe get some insight from about how they can proceed in their own lives to tend to their own corner of the garden. Everyone's got their own little thing where they can be of use, and it's up to us to help them find it.
Well, we will leave it there for time. Bill Duncan, thanks to you and your work, and of course, our special guest, Kevin Williamson from the Dispatch. Thanks for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
We're going to take a quick break before we leave you all with some final talking points from this conversation. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back, and thanks again to Kevin Williamson from the Dispatch and Sutherland's Bill Duncan. If you're trying to persuade someone that the size, scope, and influence of the federal government needs to be reined in, I want you to try sharing these 3 principles and see how it goes. First, as voters, we should care more about the constitutional structure and the appropriate process for sound policymaking than we do about specific policy outcomes. I hear all the time people describe their political philosophy as simply, I just support what works. Frankly, I think this is wrong because it implies that you will support whatever approach gives you the policy outcomes you want. But that's not how our system is designed. It's intended to have guardrails for how we do policymaking. If we really claim to love America, then we have to embrace the constitutional structure as the way to make public policy decisions. Second, if we accept the constitutional structure, that means we must not only accept, but defend separation of powers as a core American principle of governance. That separation of powers is both lateral, meaning properly defined, distinct roles for the presidency, Congress, and the court, and it's vertical, meaning the principle of federalism, that some things are left to the states, not to the federal government. If you muddy any of those lines, you are not embracing American principles of governance. And third, as voters, it's essential that when we're selecting candidates for public office, we choose workhorses, not show horses. Support people who want to do the hard work of governing, not the easy, cheap work of just spouting off on social media or having lots of TV hits. Self-government is hard, and it's important that we take the hard work of self-government seriously. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it valuable. Lastly, if you want to support the broader work of Sutherland Institute, if you want to see more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.